Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hope everybody's well this afternoon. And this is Psych 301 Research, Design, and Methodology. Hope everybody's doing well as always. And as always, I want to apologize that we have to do the class this way. Definitely not the best way to do a class, no doubt about it. So, should have the quiz, and the quiz, Stats Quiz 3, is due on Tuesday at midnight. So, Tuesday at midnight to finish off Stats Quiz 3, and then the only thing we'll have left after that is the final exam. So, let's talk about our lecture today. Our lecture today is about survey research, and this is part 2, survey research part 2. So, last time we had lecture, it's been a while, but if you remember, what we talked about was the survey sampling techniques. We talked about convenience sampling, we talked about quota sampling, and then we talked about the 3 different types of probability sampling: simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, and multi-stage sampling. So we're going to continue today, and I had a couple more things to say about sampling. So here's our types of sampling. First was convenience sampling. Second was quota sampling. And then third is the 3 types of probability sampling. We talked about 3 different types: simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, and multi-stage sampling, but they're all types of probability sampling because they have a random selection component, right? Okay, now, as you go down the list, each type of sampling is more accurate, but also more expensive. As you go down the list, each type of sampling is more accurate, but also more expensive. And here's the point I wanted to make. We did talk about problems caused by convenience and quota sampling in previous surveys, that's for sure. But even if you do probability sampling, your sample is never going to be 100% representative of the population for reasons we're going to discuss probably in the next lecture. Now, that means that we're only talking about degrees of accuracy when we're talking about the different sampling techniques. And so it can be the case that the costs of doing a particular type of sampling are not worth the increase in accuracy. And the reality is, most of the surveys that are done in the world are probably convenience samples, and I don't think there's anything really wrong with that as long as you understand the potential problems with convenience samples. So yes, absolutely, if you are doing a survey on who's going to win the presidential election for Time magazine, you ought to be using probability sampling, because it's important to be very accurate under those circumstances. But there can be a lot of cases where you might have a need to do some sampling, to do a survey, to get you some information where you don't really care. It's not important that it be exactly accurate down to the 12th decimal place. Let's give you an example. I see a lot of the student groups around selling things in the hallways of Lago to try and make money for their group. I've seen some sell donuts, I've seen some sell cookies, and I've seen some sell pizza. So let's say you wanted to sell something for your student group, but you'd like to do maybe some low-level marketing research to make sure that what you're going to sell is something that people are going to like. Now, under those circumstances, let's say you wanted to do a probability sample under those circumstances. Well, what you'd have to do is you'd have to get the names of everybody who's in Lagomarsino Hall during the course of a day. You then randomly select a certain percentage of them, and you contact them and ask them whether they like cookies or donuts or pizza better, or whether they'd be more likely to buy one or the other. That would be ridiculous for what you're trying to do. It would take way too much time, not be worth the effort for the information you could get. I'd suggest doing a convenience sample there. I'd just stand out in the hallway by where you're going to start selling whatever it is you're selling, and just stop people in the hallway and ask them whether they prefer donuts or cookies or pizza. That is probably worth your time, and you don't really care if the results are accurate out to the second decimal place when you do this. You just want to make sure that you aren't selling something that nobody's going to want to buy. And so there's nothing wrong at all with doing a convenience sample in that case. So here's the point I want to make, and I want you to think that people are bad people if they do convenience samples. If the population to which you would like to generalize is fairly homogeneous and exact accuracy is not vital, then convenience or quota sampling are cheap and reasonable alternatives to probability sampling. So I don't want you to think that you have to do a probability sample if you're doing a survey. That's not the case. It's okay to use a convenience or a quota survey as long as you understand there's going to be some potential bias in the sample, more so than with probability sampling. Okay, well, that's all I had to say about sampling, and like I said, what you need to know for the test is, from a description of how somebody did their sampling, you have to tell me which of those 5 sampling techniques the person was using. All right, now we're going to move on from sampling and talk about the variables that can influence how surveys come out. And I went into school today and I brought this overhead that I wanted to show you last time. This is kind of what I wanted to explain. Now, if you remember, before the 2016 election, virtually all the surveys predicted that Hillary Clinton would win the presidential election in 2016. And there was this guy, he was the head of the Princeton Consortium. These were people who were like trying to combine all the polls to get an estimate. And he gave a 99% chance that Clinton would win. And he said he would go on TV and he'd eat a bug if Clinton didn't win. Well, he was such a smug guy. I was pretty happy when he actually had to eat the bug, I'll admit, because he was so smug. And I remember Huffington Post said 98% chance. And then Nate Silver, who's at the 538 blog, he's a very famous pollster. I believe he only said a 70% chance, and everybody was making fun of him for saying there was only a 70% chance Hillary would win. Well, you know how the election came out. I wanted to show you these states here because they were some of the most egregious in how bad the polls were. So here, what I did was, there's this website called Real Clear Politics, and they keep track of all the polls that are done, and then they have like a running average of the polls to try and aggregate the polls right before the election. So these were the very last poll averages of all the polls that have been taken in the 2 weeks prior to the election. And you can see these are cases in which they over-predicted by quite a bit the vote for Hillary Clinton. And I know not much is made of Iowa because Trump was predicted to win Iowa, but that's one of the places, our state was one where the polls were most inaccurate, almost 7% off. And these were surveys that claimed to be, most of them plus or minus 3% in their margin of error, and now they're all off from the actual vote totals. Well, this is what I want to talk to you about, and this is what I want you to educate your fellow citizens about, because there's a lot of misinformation and people who don't understand what the margin of error means in surveys and all the different variables that can influence how surveys come out. That's what we're going to be talking about today, and then also in the lecture on Wednesday, is what explains this. After we're done talking about the factors that can influence surveys, we're going to come back to this and try to explain why the polls were so wrong for this particular election. But what we're going to talk about now then is factors to consider when evaluating surveys. Factors to consider when evaluating surveys. That's the title of this part of the lecture. Okay, well, first one is, and we've already talked about this one, bias in choosing the sample. Bias in choosing the sample. Let me put this underlined and bold because this is a big list here. Bias in choosing the sample. Okay, so we talked about the presidential election of 1936 in particular, where all the polls predicted that Landon would win, and then Roosevelt wound up winning the election. And we talked about how the Literary Digest, the reason it was wrong was because it was using convenient sample. It oversampled rich people, and so that was the problem. Now, you'd think usually surveys are careful about this if they're careful about anything. They're very careful in how they choose their sample, and that's often the only information they'll give you, like in the newspaper when they report the survey, is how the sample was selected. But it's still a problem even today. It's still a problem even today. Let me give you an example. There's this woman named Cher Hite, and she writes books about women's sex lives. And the way she writes her books is she sends out surveys to many, many thousands of women, and then women will mail them back to her. And then essentially she publishes the results of the surveys in her book. And the surveys include some like essay-type questions, and she'll extract from the essay questions to write her books now. Now, in her third book, it was called The Hite Report, she distributed 100,000 questionnaires through women's organizations, primarily the League of Women Voters and the National Organization for Women, and asked them women about their sex lives. And I want to show you the results she got for some of the questions when she did this. I'm going to try and show a few of the questions here. All right, there we go. Okay, so she asked these women, are you satisfied emotionally with your relationship? Only 16% said yes when she asked them that. Are you getting more emotional support? Are you giving more emotional support to your partner than you're getting back? 96% said yes. And then this was the kicker that made her really famous, which was, are you having sex outside your marriage? And this was asked of women married 5 years or more. 70% said yes. Oh my goodness. Maybe I'm very naive. I've never been married myself, but that just seems awfully high to me. I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical. And other people were skeptical at the time, too. Really? 70% of women are having sex outside their marriage? So people looked at the survey a little more closely. Now, she sent out over 100,000 of these questionnaires. She got 3,000 of the questionnaires back. Now, in survey research, usually you can publish it if you've got more than a 50% return rate, but that's pretty much the worst you could probably publish it at. So if you've got a return rate much lower than that, they usually will not publish it, and an 80% return rate is usually considered good. Well, she sent out over 100,000 questionnaires, got 3,000 back. She's got a 3% return rate. And a 3% return rate, that's so bad, I mean, it's just, there's no adjective to describe how bad it is. It's horrible. And so the question is, what sort of women, why did so few people turn it in for the first question? And, 80% return rate is pretty typical, so people aren't that averse to doing it. Well, they had lots of essay questions and things, and it was 12 pages long. If you wanted to do the whole thing, it would probably take you 4 hours to do it. So what sort of woman is willing to take 4 hours to do a survey about the most intimate details about her life? Well, I think it's a woman who's really, really pissed off about her sex life and wants to tell somebody about it. And so I think that's why they got the crazy results here. Now, ABC News, because the results were so crazy, they decided to go and do their own telephone survey using probability sampling and ask the same questions. So let me move this over so you can see how the ABC survey came out. So you're satisfied emotionally with your relationship, 93% said yes. Are you giving more emotional support to your partner than you're getting back? 42.5% said yes. And then are you having sex outside your marriage? Only 6% said yes. Much big difference here. All right, now I don't believe the 70% figure, that's for sure, but I don't believe the 6% figure either, because imagine this was a telephone survey. Imagine how this survey was conducted. Hello, I'm doing a survey today. First question, are you cheating on your husband? Why, yes. Yes, I am. Yeah, I know. It seems a little unlikely that they would do that, but 6% did. So I think this is probably a little bit low. The real number is somewhere between 6% and 70%. But the point is, here, bias in choosing the sample almost certainly produced the results that she got from her survey. That's the point here. Okay, there are some factors that do bias modern survey sampling. And so let's talk about those. This is underneath bias in choosing the sample. So these are factors frequently biasing modern polling. One is that unless it's a presidential election, Alaska and Hawaii are rarely included. That's because it's so expensive to call them, and so typically when you see the results of a survey, it's only the lower 48 states that participated. Why did it do that to me? All right, I'm going to call this A instead of 1. Don't do that. A. Why is it doing this? Oh no, it's insert instead of delete. Please don't do that. Okay, don't insert. All right, frequently modern polling research, and number A is Alaska and Hawaii are rarely included. B, second thing is 7 to 8% of U.S. households cannot be reached by telephone. So either their telephone isn't working, or they don't have a telephone listed. They just have their cell phone, and this is something that's getting worse rather than better. If you're like me, you probably use your cell phone for almost everything, not your landline, and your cell phone tells you who's calling, and if you're like me and you don't know who the caller is, you probably don't answer. And so you're getting, this is becoming more of a problem. It's now much harder to reach the majority of people by telephone than it used to be. And then C, some polls exclude people with unlisted numbers. Some polls exclude people with unlisted numbers. So the cheapo polls really do like get out the phone directory and then call people up from that. The good polling firms do not do that. And the reason is that there is a difference between people who have their numbers listed and those who have them unlisted. Specifically, wealthier people are more likely not to list their number, it turns out. And then in different parts of the country, people are more or less likely to list their number. So I think around here, most people are willing to list their number. When I lived in Los Angeles, most people do not list their number. Well, how can you call somebody if you don't know their number? Well, here's what the good polling firms do. Usually the good polling firms are doing some kind of multi-stage sample, where typically what they've done is they've had the computer randomly select the area code, that's the first 3 numbers, like around here it's 515, and then probably an exchange code within the area code, so like Ames exchange codes are 233, 232, 379, they're probably 294, and probably others as well. And then on the good polling firms, what they'll do is they'll just randomly generate the last 4 numbers of the telephone number and then call that number. So it doesn't matter, listed or unlisted, it's going to call the number. Now, it might not be anybody's number, of course, and then they just have the computer generate a new number. Or it might be a business, and they'll generate a new number then. But this is a way, when they get a household, well, then that's a way of randomly selecting the household. So that's not a bad way of doing it. Now, the good polling firms now have another problem. You just called this number. You don't know anything about it or who's there or anything. And the problem with just talking to the person who picked up the phone is that in certain households, there may be somebody who usually picks up the phone. Like when I was growing up, my mom would almost always answer the phone. It was almost always for her when somebody called. And so you don't want to necessarily talk to the person who answered the phone. What you want is to randomly select somebody in the household that you have contacted. And so here's, you can think about this for a second because it is a hard problem. How do you randomly select somebody in a house when you don't know how many people are there? And what would be like a random way of doing it that wouldn't be correlated with their age or their sex or their race or their religion or anything else? And the clever way they do it is, the good polling firms, is once they get somebody on the phone, they ask them, I want to talk to the person in your household who has the next birthday. So everybody has a birthday, so that doesn't exclude anybody, and we wouldn't expect birthdays to be correlated with, any demographic variable probably. And so that's how they do it. That's how they randomly select somebody in the household. And what you're supposed to do is, let's say that person isn't there, you're supposed to say, okay, I'm going to call back again, and to try and get them. And so typically, if you're a good polling firm, you're supposed to make 2 callbacks before you give up on the person, because if otherwise you just say, well, I'm going to talk to you, well, of course, now you're introducing bias into the sample. So that's how most of them do it these days. Now, it's becoming harder and harder not to have a biased sample because more and more people are having cell phones. The sort of people who are willing to pick up a number they don't know on their cell phone is going to be different than the people who are willing to do that. And so that's going to introduce bias into the sample. If you got the money, you still can get door-to-door sampling just like Gallup did in the 1930s. It's extremely expensive, but it is also the most accurate way to do a survey, and that's door-to-door. All right, so that's the first one I wanted to talk about today. Second one is lack of full disclosure when reporting the results. Lack of full disclosure when reporting the results. Now, most of the surveys that are done in the world are not done for political elections or for political issues at all. They're done as marketing research for companies that want to sell their products. And if you've been contacted, maybe for Iowans, this might not be the case because we get contacted a lot because the first caucus is here. But for most people, when they get contacted by a survey, they're a lot more likely to be contacted by a business than they are for a political issue. And this introduces the problem that when businesses get their survey results back, they often misrepresent them in order to try to sell their product. Let me give you an example of what I mean. So here is a survey. What they tell you, this was in an ad for Litton Microwave, 76% of independent microwave oven technicians surveyed recommended Litton. That's what they told you. All right, what they didn't tell you is only technicians authorized to service Litton microwaves were surveyed. Makes sense. That's probably whose addresses they had and phone numbers, but really sleazy. Of course, Litton microwave oven technicians are going to recommend Litton. All right, that's not too bad. This one is really bad, though. Let's look at this one. This is 2 cigarette brands. This was used in their advertising. And the headline on the advertising was Triumph beats Merit. And two different cigarette brands. Triumph beats Merit. An amazing 60% of people surveyed said Triumph tastes as good or better than Merit. 60% said Triumph tastes as good or better than Merit. All right, let me show you the actual results of the survey. Do remember it says in the headline, Triumph beats Merit. So let's go. The actual results were 36% preferred Triumph, 40% preferred Merit. and then 24% had no preference. So Triumph actually got fewer votes than Merit. Triumph beats Merit. So what they did was an amazing 60% of people surveyed said Triumph tastes as good or better than Merit. They took the 24% who had no preference, added on to the 36% who said preferred Triumph, the ones who had no preference. They're saying it's as good as Merit. So that would be 60% said Triumph is as good or better than Merit. So really sleazy way to present this material. All right, here's another one that was used in the ad for 501 Jeans. So 90% of college students surveyed, this is a little, let me see if I can make the type a little bigger for you. 90% of college students surveyed say Levi's 501 jeans are in on campus in a fall fashion survey of 100 U.S. campuses. Oh my goodness, 90%? I don't even get 90% of people to agree on what day of the week it is. So 90% say 501 jeans are in. How did they manage to do that? Well, it sounds like what they did was they just walked up to people and said, what's in on campus? And 90% of people spontaneously said, well, Levi's 501 jeans are in on campus. That's not what they did. What they did was they said, students are asked which of the following are in. It's probably yeah, I can't blow this up too much. I think you can probably see it. And what you'll see is they got this weird selection of stuff. But if you wanted to say that jeans were in, well, your only option here was to say Levi's 501 jeans were in. So again, they're really being sleazy in what they're telling you about these things. Okay, so you got to be careful when businesses make claims about their surveys. They're often not going to tell you all the information you would need to actually evaluate the survey. All right, number 3. Let's start down here. 3. Lying by lying by polling respondents. Lying by polling respondents. I hope I'm not going to burst your bubble here, but people are liars. Foul, stinking, filthy liars. And because of that, you've always got this problem that non-respondents, people may not be telling you the truth about socially controversial issues, let's say. So one study done in the 1960s, they asked people matters that are matters of public record that anybody can look up about you if they want to. So they did a telephone survey, randomly selected, where they asked people, do you have a currently valid library card at your local public library? Do you have a currently valid driver's license in the state in which you live? And did you vote in the last election at the address you currently live at? And it turns out people would lie about all those things. People were very likely to lie about having a library card or a driver's license. But the biggest liars of all in the whole thing were college graduates who were very, very likely to say that they had voted in the last election in particular when they really haven't. They did a study in the 1950s where they asked people what magazines they read, and this is a long time ago. And Harper's Magazine, which still exists today, is a very classy, intellectual magazine. True Story, at the time, I don't think it exists anymore, but it was a lot like National Enquirer. It was a real trashy magazine. And so when you survey people as to which magazines they read, Harper's always finished very high in the survey. True Story finished very low. Well, thing is that True Story sells 10 times as many copies as Harper's in the 1950s, so people are lying about this. Okay, well, to show you the utility of this, maybe of looking at things other than just survey reports and taking what people tell you with a grain of salt, there's this project called the Tucson Garbage Project within the anthropology department at the University of Arizona. Turns out archaeologists, when they go to an ancient site, one of the most valuable things they can find about the ancient site is the garbage dump. They find out where the people put their garbage. You can learn a lot of information about how those people lived. So you can learn like what was abundant in the culture. If people are throwing things away, then they must not have been super valuable. So you can see what sort of things are abundant. And then often the most important thing is you can see what they ate if you look at the garbage dump. So these researchers at the University of Arizona thought, well, maybe we could actually learn about how people live today by looking at their garbage. And so that's what they do, is they examine people's garbage. And to show the utility of their approach, they did the following. What they did was they did a telephone survey where they asked people living in Tucson, how much beer does your household consume in an average week? I'm going to show this kind of in a weird way because I don't want to reveal it all. So how much, you won't be able to see the top part, but what it says is how much beer does your household consume in an average week? And here are the results of the survey. More than 8 cans, 0%. There wasn't a single household that they surveyed that drank more than 8 cans of beer a week. 1 to 8 cans, 15% said that, and then 85% of the people in the survey said none. Well, then they did like kind of a mean thing. What they did was they waited until garbage day, and they went out and actually looked through the people's garbage that they had contacted on the phone and counted the number of beer cans in their garbage that week. And here's what they found. Percentage actual, 54% had more than 8 cans in their garbage, 21% had 1 to 8 cans, and only 25% had none. Well, people are liars. They want you to make you think that they drink a lot less than they do, and so they will lie about this. So here's the what you should really believe, and here's what people are telling us in the survey. Yeah, there are some issues that are simply out of bounds to science where we're never going to know. Let's take this. How are we going to find out? What if we wanted to know how often does the average person brush their teeth during the course of the day? Now, if you're like my dentist thinks you ought to be brushing, 10 to 12 times a day or something. And when I go to the dentist and they ask me, so how often do you brush? Me? Oh, 10 to 12 times a day. Oh, yeah. So people are not going to tell you the truth about that. There's no way we will ever know how often the average person actually brushes their teeth during a day because people will lie about it. All right, so that's number 3, lying by poll respondents. This could always be a problem, but the more you're getting into socially sensitive topics, the more of a problem it'll be. Number 4, factors that can influence surveys is non-respondents influencing the sample. Non-respondents influencing the sample. This is a huge one. So no matter how carefully you do the survey, how careful you are with your random selection, it's always going to be the case that your survey is going to have a biased sample. And the reason it always is there's always going to be some people who refuse to do the survey, non-respondents, and the non-respondents are going to differ systematically from the people who are willing to do the survey. So that's always going to be a problem. That's why I said right out at the beginning of class today, even if you do probability sampling, you're going to have a biased sample because of the non-respondent. So that's what I meant when I said no matter how careful you are about your sampling, your sample's always going to be biased just because of the non-respondents. Now, I'm going to give you an example of this. It's an old one. This was done at the Michigan Survey Research Institute. 1984 presidential election. There's this Survey Research Institute at the University of Michigan, and they look at a bunch of different variables to see what sorts of things influence surveys. They did, in the 1984 presidential election, a series of polls early in the election. And I'll give you a chance to think about, who ran in 1984? This was before your time. Well, the president during most of the 1980s was Ronald Reagan, and he was one of the candidates in 1984. Reagan had beaten Jimmy Carter in 1980, and then in 1984 he ran against Jimmy Carter's vice president Walter Mondale. And I don't know how much you remember about American history, but it was a huge blowout election. Reagan won almost every state. Only states he lost were he lost Washington, D.C., and he lost Minnesota. Well, what they did was they did a series of surveys about who was going to win the election. And as you can imagine, Reagan won the election in a landslide. Reagan always had an advantage whenever they did this. And I believe this was done in August before the November election, so people weren't really sure who they were going to vote for at that point. Well, they did after first set of calls. After first set of calls, when they contacted people with, this was a probability sample on the telephone, Reagan had a 3% advantage after the first set of calls. But, as you can imagine, some people were home when they called, other people were not home when they called. So, what they did is they did what good surveys are supposed to do. You're supposed to do 2 callbacks before you give up. So now this is after 1 round of callbacks. So now they're going to call everybody who wasn't home the first night, ask them the question, would you vote for Reagan or Mondale? And this isn't just the callbacks, this is the callbacks added to the results they got from the first night. And now when they add the callback information, now it goes up to 6% Reagan advantage. Okay, well, the second night there were still some people who weren't home. So after 2 rounds of callbacks, now the Reagan advantage went up to 13%. Essentially everybody in the 3rd round of calling was for Reagan for some reason. So for some reason, Reagan voters were a lot less likely to be home than Mondale voters. And had you only done the survey without any callbacks, you'd think Reagan had a tiny lead, when in fact Reagan had a huge lead. There are historical instances where this has caused problems. What I mean is non-respondents influencing the sample. I think most of you are aware that when they have, like, the presidential election, they don't actually wait for the votes to be counted in the states before reporting the results. What they will do is they'll wait until the polls close, and then they will usually announce the results of their exit polling. So all the networks do exit polling where they survey people who come out of the voting booth, and then they project who's going to win on that basis. Now, the first year that the 3 networks decided to use exit polling was 1968, and CBS refused to use it. They did the traditional thing and waited for the votes to come in. But ABC and NBC decided in 1968 they were going to report the results using exit polling. Now, the way exit polling would work, and pretty much the way it still works, is they do a multi-stage sample where they have all the precincts in a particular state, and then they will randomly select certain precincts to send their pollsters to. What they were told in 1968 was that they were supposed to stop every 5th person who came out of the polling place. And what they would tell them is, look, I've got this ballot here that's identical to the ballot you just filled out inside. I want you to fill out this ballot exactly as you did when you went inside, and then fold it up and put it in this box. It's all anonymous. I'm not going to see it. And so that's how they did their surveys. Now, what they were told is, let's say the 5th person who comes out refuses to do the survey. What do you do about them? Well, they were told, well, just skip that person and go to the next one. Well, maybe you can see the problem here. That is, if there's a difference between people who are willing to fill out the survey and people who aren't, now you've introduced bias into the survey. You aren't really randomly selecting people anymore, because now your survey only includes people who are willing to fill it out. And the thing is that old people, older women in particular, were very, very reluctant to fill out the exit surveys. And as a result, that meant older people were underrepresented in their sample when they were all done. And it was embarrassing that in 1968, both ABC and NBC called several of the elections incorrectly. And the entire reason was because of the bias in their sample when they asked people, because people wouldn't fill it out sometimes. Okay, well, they've gotten a lot better than they were when they originally did this. And now what they do is it's essentially the same process, multi-stage sample, where they've selected certain precincts they're going to go to. And yeah, usually it's every fifth person they're supposed to ask. But let's say one of the people you ask says, no, I won't fill it out. Well, now in addition to having the ballot on the survey, at the bottom they have demographic information that would typically ask the sex, the race, the religion, and the age, minimally, of the people who voted. And when you see like the election results broken down by sex and race and age, well, that's where that information is coming from. It's that demographic information from the exit surveys. Well, now what they're supposed to do is, if somebody refuses to fill out a survey, the poll takers are supposed to guess at their sex and their age and their race, and then put a blank ballot in the box for that person. Then when you're all done, what you do is you assume all the blank ballots that they would have voted the same way as the people in their demographic group that did fill out ballots. So what I mean is, if, let's say, 60% of white women between the ages of 40 and 50 voted for Hillary Clinton, well, then you assume that 60% of white women between 40 and 50 that didn't fill out the survey, they also would have voted for Hillary Clinton. Now, there's no reason that this has to work. It still could be the case that people who don't fill out the survey are different from the people in their demographic group that did fill out the survey, but it turns out it does work. If you do it this way, then you'll almost always call the election correctly with your exit survey. And so that's how they do it now. That's also when they break down the results by like sex and age and race and education, how different groups voted. That's what they're using. They're using that demographic information at the bottom of the survey. So this is a huge deal, and it's a source of error in surveys that it's not going to be at all easy to overcome. This is one of the main problems with survey research. And so when you're evaluating a survey, you gotta know how many non-respondents they had. You gotta know how they were handled, because if they aren't calling people back, you can see from this thing from the Survey Research Institute, you're gonna get an inaccurate survey almost certainly. All right, so that's number 4, and that's why all surveys can't be the survey sampling can never be 100% unbiased just because of that. All right, last one I wanted to talk about today is characteristics of the poll taker. You have to have somebody take the poll, and the characteristics of the person who takes the poll can influence the results. They've done social psych experiments where they've manipulated how well dressed the poll taker is. So they can be in like business attire, corporate attire, suit and tie, or business dress or business suit for women. Or they could be dressed kind of casually with like a t-shirt and jeans. And what you find is, if it's a question where people rate on a scale from 1 to 10, how much you like the president, well, what you'll find is that you'll get more extreme scores if a casually dressed person asks the question, and you'll get fewer extreme scores if a well-dressed person asks the question. So for whatever reason, if the person looks like they're professional, people aren't as willing to go to extremes. You'll also find, let's say it's some kind of issue that has a racial dimension to it, like, say, affirmative action, for example, would be a kind of a racial dimension to the question. Turns out, let's say you have a racial minority ask people about affirmative action. You will get more pro-minority responses than if you were to have a non-racial minority ask the question. So that's not maybe too surprising. And in fact, Gallup, when he was hiring his poll takers in the 1930s, and remember these were doing their polls face to face and door to door, he would only hire women to do his surveys because he found that people were more willing to be honest with women about what they actually thought than they were with men. Now, if you're doing a telephone survey, yeah, this could matter. They might be able to guess the sex and age and maybe race of the person based on their voice on the telephone. More and more people are going to polls that are done over the internet where there's not really a poll taker, and that's kind of a nice way to do it, I think. If you do it by mail or if you do it over the internet, then you don't have this problem with characteristics of the poll taker influencing the results. Okay, well, that's all I wanted to say today. We're going to continue with this list for lecture on Wednesday. So we'll talk to you all then. Have a good week, everybody.